Paris, January 21st, 1793. The dawn does not rise, it bleeds. A cold mist rolls through the streets like a ghost, veiling the city in shades of gray and sorrow. Frost clings to the cobblestones. The breath of thousands mingles in the frozen air, white clouds of anticipation and fear. The bells of the nearby church have long fallen silent. In their place, drums. A slow, steady thunder that beats like the heart of death itself. Hood, hood, hood. The crowd has gathered in the Place de la Revolution. A sea of wool coats, trembling hands, and eyes that dare not blink. 20,000 souls pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the moment when history will exhale. No one speaks. Even whispers feel like sins here. At the center of the square, it waits, the guillotine. Tall, wooden, glistening with frost, the blade hanging motionless, a shard of winter steel. The revolutionaries call it the national razor, but this morning, it feels more like an altar. Beneath it, a basket lined with straw, already stiff from old stains of crimson. The silence breaks with the creak of a carriage. Horses snort white plumes into the air as the wheels crunch over the frozen ground. A man steps out, broad-shouldered, calm, almost regal in his stillness. His coat is plain, his face pale yet composed. There are no crowns left to weigh him down, only the gravity of the moment. Louis XVI, once the voice of God in France. Now just a man, stripped of title, power, and mercy, about to face his own people's justice. The drummers pound louder as he walks toward the scaffold. Each step echoes against the wood, soft, deliberate, final. When they move to bind his hands, he resists for a moment. "Do not bind me," he whispers. "Do what you are ordered, but do not bind me." Then, as if surrendering not to them but to heaven itself, he bows his head in quiet prayer. He ascends the wooden steps. The platform creaks beneath his boots. Somewhere in the crowd, a child begins to cry, quickly hushed by trembling hands. Above, the clouds are heavy and unmoving, as though the sky itself refuses to witness what's coming. Louis turns, searching the faces below. Thousands of strangers, one nation of rage. He raises his hand, commanding silence. The drummers hesitate. The world holds its breath. And in that terrible pause between heartbeats, between life and oblivion, Paris seems to freeze in time. Because the truth of this morning is far darker than most accounts reveal. If you're already feeling the chill of that Paris morning, tap like. It helps more history lovers find Cursed Chronicles. And if you love stories that whisper from the darker corners of history, make sure you subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. He was not born a monster. Louis Auguste, as he was first known, entered the world on August 23, 1754, not in the shadow of power, but in the quiet corridors of Versailles, a boy more curious than commanding. While others around him learned to bow, posture, and charm, he learned to observe. His tutors said he had a mind made for study, not for rule. He could lose himself for hours in books, tracing the edges of maps or scribbling notes about the stars. But most of all, he loved to build small locks, gears, keys that turned in perfect precision. Inside the palace, a room was given to him, a workshop hidden among the glittering halls of gold. There, among files, screws, and cold iron, the young prince found a sense of control the court could never offer him. The sound of turning metal soothed him more than music ever could. He would run his fingers over the finished locks, smiling faintly, unaware that one day, the kingdom itself would become a mechanism he could not open. Those who watched him mistook silence for dullness. They laughed softly behind his back, a future king who preferred solitude to conversation. He was clumsy in manner, shy at banquets, uncomfortable in the games of charm and flattery that ruled Versailles. And yet, those who knew him well saw a gentleness, a sincerity that did not belong to his age. He wanted to be liked. He wanted to be loved. At 15, duty demanded what affection never could, a marriage. His bride, Marie Antoinette of Austria, was 14, radiant, lively, everything he was not. The match was political, the celebration grand, the expectations impossible. The court glimmered with candlelight, music, and the laughter of nobles who whispered of alliances and heirs. But beneath that glitter lay discomfort. The groom stammered through his vows. The bride smiled too brightly. And when the doors to their wedding chamber closed that night, the silence returned. The marriage would remain unconsummated for 7 long years. In the whispering halls of Europe, the rumors were merciless. Pamphlets mocked the awkward prince. Jests about his manhood crossed borders, staining the young couple with humiliation. The future king avoided confrontation, He buried himself in books and locks, in the safety of his workshop, while the queen sought joy in music, fashion, and the theater of distraction. Yet in private letters he showed tenderness. He wrote of her kindness, her laughter, her devotion as mother years later. Beneath the weight of crown and gossip, there grew a fragile bond, imperfect but human. He was not incapable of love, only afraid to lose it. Still, the palace was an unforgiving stage. The courtiers saw him as indecisive, his subjects distant, and his wife foreign. What neither they nor he understood was that his greatest flaw was the same as his virtue, compassion. He could not rule with cruelty, and in the coming years, that would be his undoing. A man of gentleness born into an age of knives. A soul that sought understanding, trapped in a storm that demanded blood. He would inherit not only a throne but a curse, one that even the strongest lock could not contain. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these lost stories travel. And if you want to walk further into the hidden corridors of history, make sure you're subscribed to Cursed Chronicles. There are more truths waiting behind the next door. In the spring of 1774, the bells of France tolled for a king. Louis XV was dead, taken by smallpox, and the boy who had once hidden among his tools was suddenly the ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. The crown that was lifted toward him at Rheims Cathedral glittered with 1,000 jewels, but it felt heavy, almost reluctant. During the ceremony, as the bishop lowered it onto his head, it slipped for a moment, just long enough for an uneasy murmur to ripple through the congregation. Some called it a bad omen. Louis said nothing, but in that fleeting slip, something inside him understood what the years ahead would demand. The France he inherited was a kingdom drowning in luxury and debt. Centuries of war had emptied its coffers, and the American Revolution, which he had nobly funded in the name of liberty, bled the treasury further. The nobility paid nothing, the clergy even less. The weight of the kingdom's suffering fell on the shoulders of peasants and merchants, their backs bent by taxes they could no longer bear. Bread, the lifeblood of the poor, became scarcer each season. In the streets of Paris, mothers bartered heirlooms for a single loaf. In the countryside, fields once golden with wheat turned to dust under the weight of endless levies. Yet Louis believed, with the same quiet stubbornness that defined his life, that goodness could heal a kingdom. He ended the use of torture in criminal trials. He allowed Protestants a measure of freedom long denied. He spoke earnestly of reform, appointing men of vision, Turgot Necker, to repair what centuries of indulgence had broken. But every time he reached for progress, the aristocracy pulled him back. The courtiers, whose powdered wigs and jeweled cuffs had never touched dirt, scoffed at the idea of sacrifice. The very people who toasted his coronation resisted every change that might threaten their comfort. He tried diplomacy, persuasion, patience. When those failed, he withdrew. His diary from that time is filled with the smallest entries. Nothing. Hunted. Good weather. To the world, they seemed meaningless, but to Louis, they were the refuge of a man drowning quietly beneath the noise of a collapsing throne. In 1786, he took a step that would decide the fate of France. Desperate to stabilize the kingdom, he called upon the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of nobles and clergy who had not been summoned in over a century. It was his last attempt to bridge the chasm between crown and people. He asked them, humbly, to agree that they too must pay taxes. The answer was laughter, ridicule, refusal. The privileged turned away from him, and with that, the last support beneath his rule began to rot. Outside the gilded walls, the anger grew teeth. Pamphlets flooded Paris, crude, merciless caricatures of the king and his Austrian queen. They mocked his hesitation, her spending, their distance from the people. At night, anonymous writers inked the rage of a starving nation onto cheap paper, calling for justice, for vengeance, for revolution. Within Versailles, Louis wandered the endless mirrored halls, a ghost in his own palace. The chandeliers still burned, the music still played, but beneath the laughter, the marble cracked. He could hear the sound if he listened closely enough, the faint tremor of a nation shifting beneath his feet. He had wanted to be a king of mercy, but mercy had no place in a world demanding blood. The kingdom was no longer his to guide. It was a tide, rising beyond control, pulling him toward the storm that would soon swallow him whole. If you believe even kings can be prisoners of their time, subscribe, because here on Cursed Chronicles, we uncover the truths history tried to bury. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? The first sparks of rebellion did not roar, they whispered. It began in salons and taverns, in the murmurs of thinkers who questioned what no one had dared before, whether kings were truly chosen by God or simply by history's accident. But whispers spread like fire through dry fields. By 1789, the whispers had become shouts, and the shouts became the thunder of revolution. Louis, still believing in reason, made a decision that seemed wise at first and fatal in the end. He summoned the Estates General, a gathering of clergy, nobles, and commoners that had not met for nearly 2 centuries. The king hoped to heal the kingdom by giving his people a voice. Instead, he gave them the means to overthrow him. Inside the Grand Hall of Versailles, the Third Estate, the commoners, quickly saw the game was rigged. Each estate had one vote, which meant the nobles and clergy could always outvote the people, no matter how many they were. When the king refused to change the rules, they broke away and declared themselves the true National Assembly of France. They swore an oath never to disband until they had written a new constitution. It was not rebellion yet, but it was no longer loyalty. Louis hesitated. The man who could repair locks could not repair the machinery of power now turning against him. He ordered soldiers to Paris to maintain order, but the sight of armed men in the streets only fanned the flames. The city trembled on the edge of chaos. Then, on July 14, 1789, the inevitable came, the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille, a fortress and prison, held only 7 inmates that day, but that did not matter. Its fall was not about freedom, it was about symbolism. The crowd surged through its gates, tore down its stones, and paraded the head of its governor through the streets on a pike. The air stank of powder and blood. For the first time, the people had tasted power, and it was intoxicating. Louis rode to Paris days later, wearing the tricolor cockade, the red, white, and blue emblem of the revolution, pinned awkwardly to his hat. The gesture, meant to calm the fury, only deepened it. The king who once ruled by divine right now bowed before the people's will, and the people, seeing him bend, began to wonder how far he could be made to fall. 3 months later, another mob would come, not with questions but with hunger. On an October morning, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles, their feet sinking into the mud, their hands clutching knives and makeshift weapons. They were mothers, wives, and widows, driven not by politics but by starvation. Bread was gone, and their children were dying. They screamed for the queen, cursed her Austrian birth, and when they reached the palace, they broke through the gates. Guards were slaughtered. The crowd demanded that the royal family return with them to Paris. Louis agreed. The carriage that once carried kings in triumph now moved like a funeral procession. Behind him, the people sang songs of victory, waving the heads of his slain guards. The journey to Paris was not a return, it was captivity. At the Tuileries Palace, the royal family lived under the pretense of freedom. Guards filled the corridors. Windows were shuttered. Each letter, each visitor was watched. Louis spoke politely to the revolutionaries, praised the Constitution, smiled for ceremonies he did not believe in. But in his eyes lingered the haunted understanding that he was no longer a ruler, only a symbol waiting to be destroyed. Outside, the city shifted restlessly. Bread was scarce again. The currency collapsed. The revolution devoured its children faster than it could feed them. In the pamphlets, Louis was no longer called King of the French, but Louis Capet, a man stripped of name and divinity. His face appeared on crude drawings, bloated, cowardly, crowned in mockery. The laughter that once filled Versailles had turned into jeers echoing through the narrow streets of Paris. At night, he walked his dim corridors and listened to the muffled drums in the distance, the same rhythm that would one day mark his final hour. He knew the sound by heart now. It was the heartbeat of a kingdom coming undone. June 1791. The walls of the Tuileries had grown tighter, the air heavier. Every meal, every letter, every glance was watched. The King of France was now a prisoner in his own palace. Rumors swirled outside those walls, that foreign armies would come to his rescue, that the revolutionaries would soon kill him, that the Queen plotted with Austria in secret. Every sound in the night felt like the beginning of an end. And so Louis made a choice. He would flee. June 1791. The walls of the Tuileries had grown tighter, the air heavier. Every meal, every letter, every glance was watched. The King of France was now a prisoner in his own palace. Rumors swirled outside those walls, that foreign armies would come to his rescue, that the revolutionaries would soon kill him, that the Queen plotted with Austria in secret. Every sound in the night felt like the beginning of an end. And so Louis made a choice. He would flee. He would take his wife, his children, and escape the city that no longer bowed to him. They would reach the eastern frontier, where loyal troops waited to carry them to safety. The plan was intricate, the disguises well prepared. On the night of June 20th, a heavy carriage rolled silently through the narrow streets of Paris. Inside sat a family dressed as commoners, a governess, a nurse, a servant, and two sleepy children. But the illusion was fragile. Louis was too tall, too formal, too polite. He spoke to guards the way only a king could. At every stop, he betrayed himself in small, fatal ways, a bow too deep, a glance too cautious. By the time the carriage reached the town of Versailles, word had already spread. The postmaster, a man named Drouet, had recognized the king from the portrait on a coin. He rode ahead, raised the alarm, and by dawn, soldiers blocked the road. When Louis stepped out, he did not resist. There was no speech, no struggle. He simply looked around, as though waking from a long, cruel dream. The crowd that gathered did not cheer. They watched in silence as the royal carriage was turned around. On the road back to Paris, people lined the way, staring. No insults, no applause. Only the quiet, merciless gaze of a nation that had finally recognized its king as mortal. In that moment, the bond between ruler and ruled was severed forever. He had ceased to be the father of France. He was now its traitor. Back in the capital, the humiliation was absolute. The same hands that once clapped in reverence now pointed in judgment. The National Assembly debated what to do. To spare him would seem weakness. To punish him would shatter the last remnants of monarchy. For now, they chose pretense. Louis swore loyalty to the new constitution. He attended festivals celebrating liberty and fraternity, spoke of peace and renewal. But the people saw through it. They saw not repentance, but fear. He was a king living on borrowed time. Each day, his words mattered less. Each night, his prayers grew longer. And beyond the palace walls, a new France was taking shape, one that no longer needed its king at all. If you followed his flight this far, take a moment to like this story so more voices can discover cursed chronicles. And tell me where you're watching from. The places where history still echoes are closer than you think. December 1792. The streets of Paris were thick with winter smoke, the air filled with suspicion. The monarchy was gone, the republic proclaimed, and the man once called Louis XVI now stood before the National Convention, not as a king, but as a criminal. They called him Louis Capet, a name drawn from an ancient ancestor, meant to strip away all trace of majesty. Before him sat hundreds of deputies, faces pale in the cold light, some filled with conviction, others with unease. The charges were read aloud: conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, collusion with foreign powers, treason. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters hidden in an iron chest, sealed with his own hand, correspondence with enemy monarchs, and testimony from those who had once served him. Each word carved away the last remnants of his divine image. Yet Louis did not plead for mercy. He stood straight, his voice steady, his demeanor calm. "I have nothing to reproach myself with," he said. "I forgive my enemies and pray that my blood may secure the happiness of my people." Even his fiercest accusers could not help but feel the weight of those words. Some turned their eyes away. Others clenched their fists to silence their pity. Outside, the mood was less conflicted. The crowds that gathered each day demanded justice, vengeance, closure. They wanted the revolution to have a body to bury. In cafes, pamphlets circulated that called him a traitor who had betrayed his people to their enemies. On street corners, orators proclaimed that a republic could not live while its king still breathed. For days, the convention argued, not over guilt, for that was already decided, but over punishment. The vote was close, too close for comfort. But when the count ended, the verdict was clear enough to seal his fate: death by guillotine. No appeal. No delay. On the night before his execution, Louis asked for a final meeting with his family. The guards allowed it. Marie Antoinette entered the cold room first, her face hollowed by months of imprisonment. Their children followed, pale and trembling, and behind them his sister, Madame Elizabeth. For 2 hours they spoke softly, their voices breaking in the stillness. He blessed his children, embraced his wife, and promised, against all truth, that they would meet again soon. When they were led away, he sank to his knees, praying aloud for strength. He slept little. Before dawn, he rose, dressed in a simple gray coat, and took communion from his confessor. The guards came at 8. "Let us go," he said quietly, as though walking toward an ordinary day. Outside, the carriage waited. The drums had already begun their rhythm, distant but relentless. The streets were lined with soldiers, and the people watched in silence as the former king passed. Some crossed themselves, others spat, but most said nothing. The only sound was the steady roll of the drums, echoing against the stone walls like a heartbeat counting down to its end. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine stood ready. The platform was slick with frost, the air so cold it stung the lungs. As Louis stepped down from the carriage, a soldier reached for his hands to bind them. For a moment he refused, then, after a whisper from his confessor, he nodded and allowed it. He climbed the wooden steps without stumbling, his breath visible in the morning air. When he reached the top, he turned to the crowd. "I die innocent," he began, his voice carrying farther than expected. "I forgive those who are the cause of my death, and I pray that my blood may never fall upon France." But before he could finish, the drums thundered again, drowning his final words. The executioners moved swiftly. The blade gleamed above him, poised and waiting. A single metallic click broke the air. Then, in an instant, the world was silent. The blade fell. A dull thud. A gasp from the crowd. The man who had been king was no more. His head was lifted high by the hair, blood dripping down onto the platform. A cry rose up, "Vive la République!" And then another, until the square erupted in chaotic cheers. Some in the crowd wept. Others dipped their handkerchiefs into the blood as relics. And high above it all, the guillotine stood unmoved, its blade glinting coldly in the pale light of morning. For centuries, kings had spoken and men had died. That day, the order reversed. The silence after the blade fell did not last. It never does. For a heartbeat, the crowd stood frozen, thousands of faces suspended between disbelief and release. Then came the roar. "Vive la République!" echoed across the square, drowning out the faint hiss of blood on cold wood. The drummers pounded again, faster now, as if to remind the city that revolution had a rhythm of its own. Paris had done the unthinkable. It had killed its king. But what followed was not triumph. It was hunger. It was fear. It was the slow realization that the death of a monarch had not freed them from misery, but bound them more tightly to chaos. Across Europe, monarchs gasped in horror. From London to Vienna, kings and queens wrote letters filled with trembling rage. They spoke of France as if it were infected, a nation consumed by madness. In the days that followed, the streets of Paris smelled of gunpowder and smoke. Crowds gathered around newspapers that printed every detail of the execution. How the blade had fallen cleanly, how the head had been shown to the people, how the last words of the king had been swallowed by the drums. Some celebrated. Some prayed. Others began to whisper that something sacred had been broken. Not just a body, but an idea. The revolution had devoured its first god. Now it would hunger for more. Within months, the guillotine became a fixture, not a punishment, but a performance. The same square that had seen one royal death would soon witness thousands. Nobles, priests, merchants, writers, the blade did not discriminate. Each execution was another offering to the Republic, another sacrifice to keep the fires of fear burning. Inside the prisons, the queen waited. Marie Antoinette, stripped of jewels, gowns, and dignity, now sat in a small stone cell. The woman once accused of decadence now shivered in rags. Her son, the young Dauphin, had been taken from her, placed in the care of a cobbler tasked with re-educating him as a true child of the Republic. The boy was beaten, starved, forced to renounce his parents. When news of it reached her, she did not scream. She simply stopped speaking of hope. In October 1793, her trial began. The accusations were cruel, the verdict inevitable. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in white, a symbol of innocence, or perhaps surrender. She was taken not in a closed carriage like her husband, but in an open cart, exposed to the jeers of the crowd. Her hands were tied behind her back. When she reached the scaffold, she stepped accidentally on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir," she said softly. "I did not do it on purpose." A moment later, the blade fell again. The Queen of France was gone. In the years that followed, the revolution that had promised liberty began to consume itself. Robespierre and the Jacobins ruled through terror, their ideals curdling into tyranny. The guillotine never rested. It became the heartbeat of a country in delirium. Those who had condemned the king soon met the same fate. Danton, Desmoulins, Robespierre himself. In the end, the revolution had not freed France. It had only traded one form of power for another. If this story has held you in its silence, take a moment to like this video. It helps more souls discover cursed chronicles. And tell me where you're watching from. The places where history still whispers its warnings through time. When the blood finally dried on the scaffold, France stood at a crossroads between nightmare and rebirth. The monarchy was gone, the old order obliterated, yet the promised dawn of liberty never truly arrived. What replaced the throne was not peace, but a void, one filled with suspicion, hunger, and endless executions. The guillotine became the only voice the Republic trusted. In the name of freedom, it silenced anyone who dared to think differently. Beyond France's borders, the world trembled. Monarchies across Europe gathered in uneasy alliance, their palaces echoing with fear. They called the revolution a disease, one that must be quarantined before it consumed every crown on the continent. Armies marched. Wars flared. The flames of Paris began to spread across Europe, and the ideals of liberty and equality, once whispered in secret, now carried the scent of gunpowder. Inside France, those ideals twisted into paranoia. The revolution began devouring its own architects. Leaders who had sworn brotherhood turned their speeches into accusations. The reign of terror reached its fever pitch, and in the shadow of the guillotine, heads rolled faster than words. By 1794, even the incorruptible Robespierre felt the bite of his own creation. The crowd that had once cheered his name now screamed for his death. When the blade fell on him, the revolution finally began to choke on its excess. And still, the streets did not quiet. The young Dauphin, Louis Charles, heir to a kingdom that no longer existed, withered in a damp cell, dying at 10 years old. His small heart carried the last heartbeat of the Bourbon line, silenced before it could even understand the world it had inherited. In the chaos that followed, France stumbled through governments like a drunk through broken glass. The Directory, the Consulate, and then, from the ashes, another crown. But this time, it was not divine. It was forged by ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte, a general of the Revolution, crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804. The irony was brutal. The people who had killed their king now knelt before a soldier who had crowned himself. The circle had closed. And yet, the story of Louis XVI did not vanish. His death became a mirror through which every generation of France would see itself: pride and regret, courage and cruelty, justice and vengeance. To some, he remained a symbol of tyranny. To others, a gentle man undone by history's tide. But perhaps he was neither. Perhaps he was simply what history creates most often: a man born into a role he could never fulfill, trying to be good in a world that demanded ruthlessness. More than 2 centuries later, the echoes of that morning still linger. In the square where the blade once fell, in the paintings that hang in dim museums, in the collective memory of a nation that learned the cost of revolution. Because on that cold January morning, when the drums rolled and the blade fell, France did not just kill its king. It killed the idea that power was eternal. From that silence rose a new world, one born in blood, haunted by its own beginning. This has been Chronicles. If this story has stayed with you, let it breathe a little further, like the whisper of an old ghost. Subscribe now, and step with me into the next chapter of history's darkest truths. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from. It reminds me that even in the echoes of the past, we're never truly alone.